I hope everybody can hear me still.
Yep.
Okay, so right, welcome to everybody, and it's really great to see everybody. I'm really glad that we can be here together, and I'm welcoming people from all over the world tonight to We Out Here. It's really great that we can be together, and the wonders of the internet means that we can talk about this wonderful work and the amazing craft of Black artists. So tonight's task, and I mean, I thank Lorna for inviting me to chair this. I've known Lorna now since, gosh, when did we meet, Lorna? 2015, 16, something like that?
2016, when I was starting my MA at the Royal College of Art.
And we had an in-depth conversation about Black women and knitting, and since then our paths have crossed religiously, and now in my last role as chair of the Equity Council for the Crafts Council, we've been working tirelessly on how we think and talk about craft and the Black presence in craft. And here tonight, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to talk to these amazing artists. We're going to talk to Elaine, Maggie, and Paul, all about the Black, and yeah, Elaine, Maggie, Paul, Lorna, all about the Black presence in craft and what does that actually mean in today's world, but also relate it back to this wonderful exhibition, We Out Here. And We Out Here is We Out Here in Hastings, Southeast. For those that are abroad, it's in Southeast England. It's at the bottom of I call it the bottom of the heel.
South Coast.
On the south coast of the UK. And it's an area that I've visited many oftentimes. I can get down from London in an hour, and it's an amazing place. Just sit and watch the world go by. But we're going to get started by asking some questions. So during the chat, it's going to be an informal kind of an hour of kind of chat and discussion. We ask you to put your questions in the chat, and then we're going to come back to you. And for the last kind of half an hour, 20 minutes, we're going to ask some Q&A. So we're going to be asking you to feed back to us, the chair and the artists. And for those out there, I am totally mad about textiles. I'm mad about craft. I'm mad about how we can talk about what craft means to us as people of colour, but also how we're often absent and present at the same time in this space that we call craft, and to kind of upend the ideas that, and I think I go back to my meeting with Lorna in 2016, when we were often told that Black women don't knit. We kept coming across this state, Black women don't knit, they only crochet. Black women don't knit, we don't see them in the canon. Yet we grew up with Black women knitting all around us. So we knew that was not the case. So we're going to start off by asking the artists to introduce themselves. And then what we're going to do is then go into some questions. So Lorna, do you want to get started?
Well, I'm terribly shy, but I'll have a go. I'm Lorna Hamilton-Brown. So most of you will know that organised this show, We Out Here, to say that as Black artists and makers, we out here in plain sight, often hidden. For those of you who don't know my work, my main medium is knit or crochet, and I don't really make jumpers.
Paul?
My name's Paul Hope. I suppose my history would start with the fact that I was very interested in museums. So I did a master's degree in museum studies in about 2007. Thought I'd want to work in the museum sector, but didn't. Then I went to the Cauldswain, as I lived in North London, and Capel Manor College, did the saddlery, harness and bridle course for 2 years, diploma in those three things. Then I went to the CAS to do upholstery. And I've just been very, very interested in leatherwork and making. and carried on making, and now I teach here in Hastings because I'm a bit fed up of moaning about the poor quality of leather work I see around me.
Maggie?
Hi, Lorna, can you do the admissions while I talk? Thanks. Hi, Rizzy. I'm Maggie Scott. I'm a textile artist, or I like the American term, fiber artist. I trained in fashion and textiles, but for the last 12 years, I have been doing work that has a political content, really. As an activist, I use my craft, mainly of felt making, to try and effect change. So that's my main preoccupation. And being part of this exhibition was just a great opportunity to have a platform. Yeah, so that's me.
And finally, Elaine.
Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Elaine Mullings. I'm a visual artist, multimedia. I'm mostly focused on sculpture and printmaking. But I went to Camberwell and did my BA in drawing, and then I went to the Slade and did MFA in sculpture. But in all my work, I always use some form of craft, some kind of making. And that's one of the things I'm really interested in, is always crafting, using some kind of technique. And so I always find a way to incorporate it in my sculptures or whatever I'm making. And like Maggie, I have wider political interests. And so the materials I use and the crafts I use usually speak to some kind of political issue that concerns me. And in this show, I was particularly interested in the racial injustice in the way of capitalist exploitation of minerals and resources in Africa. And so that's where I tend to focus my interest. Okay.
Thank you. And I should have just highlighted that for those of you out there that don't know who I am. So I am a lecturer a lecturer in design at Goldsmiths, but my background is in textiles, and I've just recently completed a PhD all about Black women in crafting and about Dorcas societies and Dorcas clubs, when Black female networks that enabled Black women to think about crafting as a practice and a process. And in my work, I looked at both the amateur makers, which are the Dorcas societies, and professional makers such as Alfie McNeish, and how through their work of crafting and textiles, they were able to place their craft center in their work, and prove that for us as women of color, that their creativity is the thing that enabled them to make their mark in the world. So as we move on, this talk is all about the place of craft and practice. So I'm going to start off with what I call my hard question to all those crafts and practices out there, and it's to Lorna, Paul, and Elaine. And the question is, the material practice of craft and pushing craft to its limits and exposing craft practice in different forms, not in its traditional forms we would expect it. Making craft, making use to think one thing whilst seeking another. And I'm thinking of Lorna's intarsia knitting that looks like a painting, like your We Make covers, and lace knitting that does not look like lace, and Maggie's Nuno shopping, leather, Paul's leather work, and Elaine's work that looks at that startling cobalt blue. They open up new conversations of the everyday and beyond, engaging us in material practices that we have in the islands of the Caribbean. Can you speak about what it is about the materials and crafts that allow you to push the envelope, so to speak?
Ooh. Who wants to go first?
I think I'd better go first then. I think for me, leather when I was learning leather work at the Cordwainers, or when I was working at the Royal Mews with Katrine Coppin, who I thought was the best leather worker ever, when I used to go to the Saddlery show, annual show, she used to win all the awards. And I knew really that I was never going to be that kind of leather worker. So then you have to redefine what you do. And for me, I just had a fascination with the stitching and the repetitive nature of stitching and the beauty of it. And so for me, it was to try and use leather, not in the three-dimensional sense, but more the two-dimensional sense, and making pictures and images on the surface of leather, which was actually celebrating the material and changing materials, because I read all the old books at the British Library on leatherwork. I spent days, weeks going there, and suddenly saw things that had been missed, tools that had been missed. So you suddenly realise the craft goes in a direction, but the books that were the actual source materials took you elsewhere. So I had a fascination with silk, and that silk was used instead of linen because it was the best quality. It didn't require wax and it was much smoother. So I took my practice into the quality area, knowing that if you started to use quality materials, if you used silver and added other precious objects to leather, you could take it to another level, because people weren't prepared to pay for things that were made in leather because they could see leather had a ceiling price. So I felt that adding value to leather, using it like a canvas, using it in other ways, was the way to make a new area. And I don't think other people work in that way. And you've really got to go away from the main body if you're going to make yourself special or different. That's how I felt about breaking into new areas of using the material.
I think I'll go next. I think following on from Paul, and he was talking about books, especially for knit. You know, I remember reading that to be a master knitter back in the day, you know, you'd sit under a master for 7 to 14 years and learn your trade. And I think for me, it's been, well, I'm not dead yet, but like a lifetime of learning about knit and stitches. And it's, as you've written, Rose, in your piece, looking back, tracing, looking back to go forward. So I look back, I look at the historic context of knitting, but I aim to push it forward. So a lot of the techniques that I use are very traditional, but I'm just using them in a new way, but I'm constantly looking back to push forward. And for me, it's this whole notion of that, you know, you'll be watching a television program and or anything, and it's like, oh, she must have been bored, she's knitting. And that whole, how they put knitting down. So I'm always looking at how can I subvert that notion of knitting, but also with work that I've got in the We Out Here show, which finishes on the 4th of June, you've still got time to visit. So with Woman Blue Elevate, which is a lace piece, so I'm usually known for graphical knits. I was looking at, why can't knit be like abstract art? You just look at it aesthetically, and it's a thing of beauty, and trying to push that, because knitting, I think particularly knitting, it gets pushed so narrow, so it either has to be very graphical or it becomes characters, and we get really confined in that. So for me, it's just looking, just as like you'd push paint or any other medium to the extreme, knit or crochet is just another thing that you can push to the extreme.
Do you want to go next, Maggie, or should I?
Yeah, no, you go. It's fine.
Well, I suppose if you had the chance to see my work in We Out Here, you'll see that I've used a real range of materials. And one of the things that's a key theme in my work is the shifting value of things, and the way that that materials are not valued at certain levels, but because the cost of those materials is elsewhere. And one of the things I use a consistent material is paper, and I craft a lot with paper. And in the sculpture, if you've had a chance to see it, of Africa, it's on quite a large scale, 2 meters by 2 meters. And I've used a really sort of disposable, ostensibly cheap material. And so paper craft generally got quite a low status. And I've tried to elevate the status of it in this work by using it on this scale, but also to show that its value in terms of its disposability, it's cheap, but it's expensive from where it comes. You know, the cost of that material is always somewhere else, it's deferred. But also to show a material in a different light. And for me, I'm always using different techniques, craft techniques, to make my work. So, you know, I've used ceramics, I've used tissue in this instance, I've used metal work, I've used all sorts of techniques. And what I enjoy about crafts is the way that I can translate that into sculpture in some way. So I don't necessarily make a piece that is a craft piece, but I use the craft techniques to make the work. So that's one of the, and I'm also interested in being a sculptor, in the sense that Black women as sculptors are not often seen. They're usually you know, well, you think of sculptures, you tend to be male, and then it tends to be European. And when Black art sculpture it's seen as a very primitive form, and it's rarely seen as a contemporary form. So that's one of the reasons I make the work that I do. Okay.
Nice. Yeah, following on from Elaine, it's very much, when I think about craft, I feel blessed in a way, because the training that we've all had, I mean, my beginnings were with fashion and textiles, but it was at a period at St. Martin's where you were able to experiment. And then my first job was as a knitwear designer, but with someone who was actually a painter and approached knitwear with that spirit. And so for me, making things, and when you talked to Rosie about pushing the boundaries, that's what's always been the case. You know, that's been the raison d'etre from the very beginning. And that's what I love about it, because as far as I'm concerned, as a crafter, as someone that uses my hands and has that skill, it means I have an idea and then I figure out, you know, how to make it work. And I'm fearless with that. And I think that's what we all share, that we have the ideas and we also have the craft skill. So, you know, moving from knitwear to weaving, from weaving to felt, and always thinking, okay, this is the technique, but you know, there's more. You know, it doesn't have to be a Loddon coat or a very thick piece. So that's how I got into Nuno felting. Many years of making very light Nuno felt to wear, for example. And so I feel like I've got this toolbox, you know, this crafting toolbox. And so when I put my mind to a particular subject, it's there for me. And it never occurs to me to repeat or to keep it small. You know, it's constantly a challenge, and an exciting challenge to expand. And perhaps this is a moment to add there that the challenge of being a Black crafter, because, you know, Elaine and I met earlier, we were in HC for another reason, we were talking to other people, but we both shared the fact that, you know, you have to break down the door and you have to make it up as you go along. You have to figure things out by yourself, because there isn't that system of mentors or teachers or leaders or anyone that's going to give you a break. So we're both, you know, we're a similar age and we're very used to just figuring it out for ourselves. And it's wonderful and it's creative, but it's also exhausting. You know, there's a price to pay for that, but you know, that's a bigger conversation. But yeah, I want to throw that in there.
I think, can I add, can I add, Maggie, can you mention about the village?
About people always assuming about your skills. Yeah.
Well, that will lead on to another. We laugh about, you know, our histories and stories with craft, but, you know, Rosie, when you were talking about this idea that, you know, people think we've just dropped out of the sky or there is no connection with the past. And one of the questions that, you know, it just made me laugh because it was very extraordinary. And it was at Origins, you know, which at the time was, you know, the pinnacle of the Craft Council's show, you know, big showcase. And I always remember someone coming up and saying, these are so beautiful. How did you, you know, where did this come from? Did you learn this in your village? And it took a while for me to understand what on earth. And actually, I have a first-class honours degree from, you know, and I gave her a sort of spiel. But, it was very extraordinary that in this day, this was 10 years ago now. So, but even so, that notion that first of all, we aren't skilled and trained and spent many years studying, but also that it's somehow imbued upon us by the nature of the color of our skin, you know, that we've, you know, it's just come to us in a dream from our ancestors. And so, yeah, that's what Lorna was referring to. Yeah.
We actually have a question from the audience, which kind of builds on that notion of craft, and we're constantly, this notion, I think, that's coming out in all your conversations, this I think from Paul, this notion of elevating, that each of you have taken the craft that you've engaged with and elevating it, because through that elevation you're actually then imbuing it with different conversations about where does craft sit, where does it belong, how are you finding those hidden stories. And one of the questions in the chat at the moment is, one of the things that come up when we talk about craft, especially textiles, is this feeling of inheritance and handing down. Which crafts did the artists think they inherit, and from whom?
Well, shall I go first? Only to give you time. I mean, my dad was,
go on, Paul.
My dad was very hands-on. He was a mechanic, and he came to this country and realised that when he went to a garage to get a job, and they asked him, it was a backstreet garage, about Rolls Royces, he realised that he wasn't going to get that job and retrained. But he could turn his hand to everything. So when he worked in engineering, he was versatile, because there was versatility pay. So the more skills you had, the more you were able to feed your family. And he used to repair our shoes. So he knew a bit about everything. So he was really, you know, an inspiration to me in believing that you could just go into his sort of back shed with lots of electricity and electrical shocks. It's so dangerous. And I kind of learned lots of things from him. And he just had to learn things, because to feed a family, you had to repair your own car, repair your own shoes. He used to use the sewing machine, and he did all these different things. And it's just seemed natural to me to pick up any craft, because, you know, my dad did.
Well, I'll go, Elaine.
No, following on from Paul, my dad was a carpenter, and he used to go to work in a suit. And people would be stunned. I said, "Oh, that's my dad. Oh, where's he going?" I was going to work in a suit, but he was meticulous in his practice as a carpenter, and his work was meticulous. And you know, he could come home and his suit would still be clean. I mean, obviously he'd wear overalls. And I think what I inherited from my dad was this attention to detail and way of working. And if he made something, you know, he might be fixing a window or building something. If he wasn't happy when it was finished, he'd take it out and start again, because he wasn't satisfied with the finish himself, where people would make do. And sometimes if somebody came to the house and did a job for him, and he paid them, and he wasn't happy with the job, he'd do it again himself to the level that he wanted. So there was always this attention to it, because he had a lot of skills. He was very, very good with his hands, and he always wanted to make it the best it could be. And I think I've taken that from him, that I would problem solve like he did, but I wanted to make the work the best it can be. That's all I say.
What I was going to say is, so I grew up, so my mum was a seamstress, so she sewed, and then my dad, he made shoes, and then later on he started to make candlewick bedspreads, so like a tufting machine, and then he taught people. And he never worked for anybody else. He was always self-employed. So I grew up knowing that you could use your hands and you could make money. You didn't have to work for somebody else. So when you grow up in that maker environment, and also another thing that informed me was, like, on a Sunday, we weren't, you might relate to this, Rose, we couldn't do anything. We had to do embroidery and sewing and stuff like that. So, you know, you picked up a lot of skills sitting under my mother and my father. So I think it's just that sense of people were making. And I'm 65, and I think of that generation, we were used to our parents making, because they had to. So you just grew up with, they were doing things. And in my my latest knitted magazine, there's a bit on it where I honour my mum. And I think growing up, I didn't realise or appreciate the skills that they had. It's just, oh, my mum sews, she doesn't use a pattern. You know, why can't she use a pattern? But realise it, you know, thinking about the skills that it takes to be able to look at something, can make it, you know, and things like that. So we grew up with it. And Rose, you mentioned about the boarding pass and the skills. It's a similar, you want to mention that? It's a similar thing.
Yeah. So for those that, in a project I've been doing at Goldsmiths with colleagues, Will Sensi and Dr. John Price, we recreated or reimagined the Windrush landing cars, but we looked at all 1,027 passengers that came off the Empire Windrush in 1948. And of those passengers, 225 of those were makers of some description. There were tailors, potters, shoemakers, whatever, but 225 of those had some kind of craft skill. Yet we never talk about those inheritances. Then you look at the islands that they came from. Then you start to look at when they were born, and we could see that some of them were born before the 20th century. So they came here anything between, some of them were in their 50s when they came, some of them were in their 20s. So some of them were born just as the First World War ended. Some of them were born before 1895-ish. So we get this range of people coming with this range of skills, yet we very rarely discuss the skills that they came with, because we're so entrenched with, oh, they came, they were invited, but we never really then go back or delve backwards. And this tracing backwards of these histories begin then to allow us to understand, well, they came with these crafting skills. How did those crafting skills actually end up on the islands? Where did those crafting skills come from? So we then start to look at our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and we can then trace back these crafting traditions. And I think one of the things that is coming that from the conversations with Paul, Elaine, Lorna, and Maggie, is this notion that these transient histories that they discuss is inherent in some of the themes that they have, like moving on, and that gives us this notion of what does moving, when we move through spaces, when we move across time, how do we talk about all these different kind of transitions that we have in both craft, but also these transitions? What does moving mean? What does moving to Hastings mean to enable you to do the craft that you've done, for instance? So what did moving to Hastings do to enable you to continue your craft that you couldn't do if you're in London or elsewhere?
I think that an acorn can't grow underneath the boughs of a large sort of oak tree. So for me, when I was in London, there were just loads of people who I would have thought could do the job that I'm doing now better than me, because there were so many people. But when you come down to a place where there is nobody, you realise that, you know, that you can get a better perspective on who you are and what you can do and what's needed in the locality that you're in. So I'm teaching at the college, and I may be proved wrong, but if they dislike the cut of my jib, having spent £4,000 on materials, there's not going to be anybody else that's going to teach leatherwork but me. Whereas if you're in London and they dislike the colour of your jib, they can get somebody else in quite easily. So I think you suddenly realise that you are unique and you're in a space where what you have to say will be listened to, and there's no one going to contradict you. That's what I think.
Wonderfully pragmatic. Practical. Well,
we're often undermined, Maggie. We're often undermined.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. Moving to Hastings, so I've been here about 5 years, a Londoner by birth, and then a long time in France, and then coming back here. What struck me, first of all, was just the difference living in a creative town. Like, you know, per square foot, Hastings has so many people doing stuff. And it just makes for a different kind of dialogue and a different kind of understanding, which is really nourishing. And then having so many Black faces on the street. I mean, that's literally how I decided from, you know, Eastbourne, where I saw 2 Black faces in my entire trip looking at flats. And both of them didn't live in Eastbourne. And suddenly coming here, and I've noticed that my cousins who come to visit me, you know, they think, oh, this is all right. I think I'm going to move down here. So there's something about having a solid Black community, a community of colour that's living and functioning, and it has an effect on our relationship with you know, the rest of the community. There's a, yeah. So that's really the moving piece. And I think the other piece to throw in is really consequently being in this group, and what that, you know, that's just been very extraordinary. You know, we're all of a similar age. I think I might be the eldest, I don't know, I'm 68. But, you know, no, Elaine and I are parallel. But, you know, having gone through the art school system, you know, I went to one of the best art schools in the time in the 70s. I've stayed, you know, all my adult life in textiles. This is the first time I've been in a group of my peers who are other artists that are Black. I mean, and that's extraordinary, and it's wonderful, but it's extraordinary it's taken this long for that to happen. So, you know, that's another reason for staying here in Hastings. And I think the last thing to say is that we're really good at moving. You know, if you just look at any of our histories, you know, we pick up and we move. You know, our families came in at that Windrush period. You know, we've moved in. I think everybody in this call has been living in different places, sometimes in different countries. We're really skilled at that. You know, picking up and starting again. So yeah. Moving just seems to be part of what we do. I can't imagine not having a life work that doesn't include moving, really. Yeah.
Yeah.
Elaine.
Me. Okay. I've been in Hastings. I actually live in St Leonard's, which is often called Hastings, but it's Hastings and St Leonard's. It's a bit like Brighton and Hove for those people who don't know the area that well. And I was speaking to my partner the other day. We moved here in 2012. And when we first moved here, I thought there were more Black people than there actually were. And that's because a lot of Black people would come here for holiday or for days out. So you always assume the people you're seeing are like you, that live here, but they don't. So at first I was a little bit disappointed that there weren't many, but over the years, they seem to have grown exponentially. Seems to be a community, and we've had a lot of different community activities. So I think when I first moved here I was a little bit concerned, but I come from London, so I'm used to seeing a lot of Black people all the time, and I felt a bit starved at first, but now over the last sort of 5-6 years that community has really grown, and it's really comfortable. It makes you feel like you found your tribe. You know, and there's a lot of crossovers in different groups, but it's really unusual, I think, because you can go to other coastal towns, which I have done, and you don't see that presence that you see here. So I think that's the one thing that I'm really comfortable here in St Leonard's because of the community. The other reason I feel about moving was because I wanted to live near the sea. And I think that's quite a common, well, it's kind of known that older Black people, when they retire, although I'm not retired now, but they tend to retire to the coastal towns. If they don't go back to their rich countries of origins, when they've, raised families here, they tend to retire by the sea. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon. And I think that's a bit of work that we could look into. Why do they do that? And who are they? And are they isolated? Or do they, do communities like the one in Hastings develop? I think that's a really interesting area to look at. And moving, I like change. And I think in the past, whenever I've thought about, and I've often thought about leaving England altogether for various reasons, I always gravitate towards those edges where the water is. And even though we have this really complex relationship with the sea for our heritage, through our, our histories, our shared histories, I still feel this gravitational pull towards the edge of England, but to be by the sea, this sort of coastal life. And I think, like Maggie was saying, the creativity here is nurturing in a way. You feed off of it because there's lots of possibilities in a way that London, London feels overwhelming in terms of possibilities. There's so much competition for it. Whereas here, I think people come here and they reinvent themselves, and it's a have a go town. You know, you will try, and that's what I like about it. People will try. Yeah, that's all.
I think for me, so I moved out of London in, I think, 94, and I moved to Leicester. And then, yeah, Midlands, and then it's like, it's cold. I want but I didn't want to move back to London. And I think there's this lie for Black people: you can't move out of London because there's no food. You can't move out of London because there'll be no hair product. You can't, and it's just like, I think the important thing is a place of rest, to go somewhere. Why can't we be in these spaces where we have a bit more rest and not be on the grind all the time? So that was important to me, and a bit warmer. That was important to me. And to be by the sea. And I think a lot of us had a relationship to Hastings as a child, being in London, coming to Hastings. And I say to people that with Hastings, sometimes you don't know why you came, but it just gets in your blood. And it just gets in your blood. And then the other thing that I would say is that in London, it's so difficult to get studio space, affordable studio space. So moving out, whether it's Hastings, it gives you that opportunity as well. So for me, the space that I have here, I would never have in London, or would I even have space?
Yeah.
So for all of you then, that the notion of moving has had this resonance of moving in terms of supporting the craft practice, but also it's resulted in we out here, because it's brought you all together to do we out here. So so in creating we out here, what have been the challenges of you all as individuals coming together in this collective space, so to actually put on this collective show as individual craft makers, but to bring this cohesive kind of element together, which talks about all these different craft practices in this space?
Well, should I go first? Because I chose them. And I think I chose people that work in a similar way to me. So it's been quite good. I don't think it has been, I mean, any relationships has challenges, but I think it's worked quite well. And from the outset, we've met on Zoom. So I think it's just, for me, can't speak for them, it's just been a natural progression.
Following on from what Maggie said about the opportunity to work with other Black artists and your peers being a similar age, but bringing different skills. So if people have had a chance to see the show, you'll see a range of skills, a range of visual expressions, and it's fantastic. And I think it's been a surprise for a lot of people that there's this caliber of artists and in amongst them making work, you know, at this level. And you go into, like, someone's called a White Cube Gallery, and you can put on a show with very little, because what we have in terms of funding isn't any great shake. But what we did have to this project is commitment, and a commitment to show Black excellence as well as Black joy. And that's, I think this show is a really good expression of that Black excellence and Black joy. And I feel that the fact that it's 6 Black artists with Caribbean heritage, we are the legacy. We are showing, you know, those are artists. Sorry, I'm not making myself clear. When we talk about those people coming over from Windrush with all their skills, those skills and those legacies are embodied in us, in who we are. And I think this show is an expression of that. That's why we called it We Out Here, because we are out here, and we're, you know, and we're present, and now we're very visible. So that's what I think. What do you say, Paul?
Yeah, I think because of the COVID situation, I think people got used to doing many things on Zoom. And I think we met once, didn't we, at Richard's, and we met cohesively on Zoom every week. And I think that we got to like meeting, we got to understand each other. And for me particularly, I felt that the great challenge was the fact that I knew that as leatherwork, everything I did was the scale of this sort of piece of jewelry. And the idea that you would have to make something that fitted in the larger space, as I know you all know, I found very challenging. And I found it quite daunting. How could you make work that would be in a gallery? And I was supported, and because I would never have made the work I made if Lorna hadn't have asked me. That area that I went into, it was not an area I would have ever visited. So I'm really thankful to have been asked, because it's opened for me a style of work that I would never have gotten to. And that's really to the group, people thinking that I could do something, Lorna selecting me, because we go down our own little kind of little alleyways where everything's comfortable. But the we out here, it's been really uncomfortable in terms of making for me. You know, having some work rejected by the gallery, really painful and difficult. New things I had to understand. And so, but then other people said, oh, that happens all the time. And having to start understanding that how you make work that fits in a gallery, that means the gallery can't remove it, because if it's on a frame on the wall, then it doesn't become the subject of someone's aesthetic appreciation. So I think as a craftsperson, it's known to others, but it's now very well known to me that, you know, people view craft different to how they view a painting, that the aesthetics of a painting or the aesthetics of sculpture is different to how they can choose to be quite dismissive or removing your work. So that's my thing, learning how to work in a new discipline and working using leather in a way that I'd never used it before.
Well, yeah, following on from Paul, it's a curious question, because in terms of us working together, I didn't think there were any challenges. It was all very positive, and I learned a lot, and the work benefited from it under Lorna's leadership. The biggest challenge was actually with the institution, and you know, again, you know, celebration and praise for Lorna, because she kept going. She was very clear about the objective, and there were several times when, you know, I just think, oh, this is ridiculous. If it wasn't for Lorna to keep us focused, and those were very big challenges I found. And you know, when Paul mentioned there about having work suddenly, you know, rejected effectively, you know, almost at the last minute, you know, those kinds of things. How do you respond? And the challenge of thinking, well, the ultimate goal to be there is worth a certain level of sacrifice. And you know, we have different levels of what's acceptable. And I was very shocked. I've been exhibiting a lot for the last 15 years. I've done a lot of shows. And, you know, Hastings Contemporary was really an eye-opener in the way that the organisation worked. And that was, I think, a huge challenge. Yeah. There's an interesting couple of questions in the chat. But yeah,
there are. I just want to follow up before I come to those questions. I think there's some interesting things that have been brought up about the relationship between the aesthetics of art and the aesthetics of craft, and this notion that as Black craftspeople, how we negotiate those boundaries between the fact that sometimes our textiles, our leather, our various crafts are not seen as art, if you like. Yet the fact that when we make these things, we elevate them to be almost to be art, but they're not seen as art. And so trying to get them into these gallery spaces and to be seen alongside art, we are challenged not only because they're not seen as art, but also we're challenged because the moment we walk into the gallery, we are seen by the colour of our skin. And those challenges that we face, do you see your work then as a form, or this collection of work as a form of curatorial activism?
A good question.
I see it as that, but I think it's also a double-edged sword. So with the likes of the G. Ben's quilts becoming the thing, it's almost like sometimes our work can be seen as too slick, because now that's kind of working with found materials is the thing, and we get pigeonholed into that. But yeah, the show was definitely an act of resistance, and I think to show Black excellence, whatever that wants to be, and that we're not going to be dictated to what the trend is, because I think we do get very much put into boxes of what the trend is going to be. Is it going to be Africa futurism or something? And it's like we can only do one thing. And with the show, I wanted to show a range, and we all work in different ways. So I think it's that, and I think, yeah, you know, it's that sort of a move back now, like, oh, well, this is very trendy. How long did G. Benz have to wait to be acknowledged? And then it's like a thing, you know. So that's what I would say. Rant over.
Anybody else want to respond? Do you think that your work is a form of curatorial activism?
Well, I think it is, because people, well, not only for all our messages, all the underlying themes in the work is about our existence, our very existence, and the fact that we still are thriving despite all the things that happen to us is an act of resistance. And the fact that we can go into a gallery and make a show that makes people turn their heads and have to go, oh, right, okay, they're here. I think that it definitely is a sort of act of resistance, because we wouldn't be forced out. It'd be so easy. I mean, as Maggie was saying, Lorna kept us on the road, and she was really the face of having to deal with them, you know, with Hastings Contemporary all the time. And maybe a lesser person might have just given up, you know, or just walked away. I might have done. But the fact that you keep going, and despite that, and you build relationships, and you go on the journey with them, you're not only creating a good show, but you're actually educating them. You're helping them understand that there is a wealth of talent right under their noses, and they should be using that and celebrating it. So in that way, it is a form of not just a resistance, but an act of activism, of celebration. So I think it's a twofold thing. And I think that's what we've done is an enormous benefit, not only to ourselves, but to them. You know, it elevates them. I think that shouldn't be ignored or understated.
Yeah.
That's my little rant.
Sorry, Maggie.
No, I was just agreeing with Elaine, and also the two of us, you know, we share a sort of political view of our work, really, in the way we work. And, you know, just speaking to what Lorna has said, that you get pigeonholed, and it's really a decision of, are we going to respond and stay within that, you know, what's expected, or can we again push the boundaries, not just in the way that we're working, but the subject matter. And I think that was what was interesting here, of, you know, thinking, well, what do I, you know, where am I in this narrative? You know, mine is really looking at waste colonialism, effectively, you know, and to move the conversation on, because I think there's a way in which racism and institutionalized racism insists on having, if you like, tropes and caricatures and very small ideas about, you know, who we are and what we're capable of, or what we're preoccupied with. And so part of this working together is also, for me personally, pushing on those boundaries and saying, where am I as someone that is living in the global north, you know, but a person, a heritage of the global south, you know, where do we sit with all of that? So, you know, to have a bigger conversation, and in a way, the activism, as Elaine says, is not just about, you know, ranting, but it's actually saying we are much broader. We are, you know, we have many positions and thoughts and ideas, and not to be pigeonholed all the time, you know. So that was, I don't know if that made sense, but it's
absolutely.
Really a broader conversation is what I was looking
I
at.
think also because institutions will say, you know, we want to diversify the artists we have, but a lot of the time what they mean is we want to be able to walk in that gallery and know that there's so-called Black art, but we should be able to paint roses or whatever we want to do, and that's Black art. It doesn't have to have the Black image in it if we don't want it to be, but it's just like with rap music, or, you know, it's that we get very pigeonholed. And then the other thing is, because we're not a monolith and we have different views. So yeah, so it's that. And I was just going to say something, and it just went out of my head.
It'll come back.
It'll come back to me. Yeah.
Can I just say Lorna led the way, and I think that the big thing is we were in the gallery today to take to introduce the work to another gallery along the coast at Bexhill at the Delaware. Every other day, Lorna will be in there, or I'll be in there, and we're speaking to members of the public. And for me, it's being seen in a gallery, and people who I don't know come up to me and ask me to tell them about work that they presume is mine, or they'll presume it's Elaine's or Lorna's or Maggie's. You know, the very fact that Black people are in a gallery and are clearly makers of the work, knowledgeable about the work, and are seen as being holders of information and power is not what normally happens. You know, so that's been one of the great things. I mean, just as well Soutine and Kossoff are dead, so otherwise they could outdo us in explaining their own work. But you know, I just think that one of the outreach things, apart from the very many outreach projects that we've done, is the fact that we have been in the gallery talking about our work. And so we really do know if our work is political, that people are picking up that message. And part of the message is that you're a Black creative craft person, and there's your work. It couldn't be more than that. There's a real line between the work, who made it, and what it means. And where lots of artists just sort of say, there it is, you work it out, we've spent a lot of time helping people understand, which I don't think is what artists normally do.
I'd agree, yeah.
I think there is so much richness in what you've all just said, and there's so much more we could go into about it. And I think the key themes that you keep coming back to, this activism, celebration of Black art, the notion of elevation, which we talked about right at the beginning, how you were elevating elevating your practice and you're elevating your craft and not being pigeonholed. We've got a couple of comments in the chat that I said I would come back to, and Olivia says that I can hear the joy and satisfaction in the work that you all do and the collaboration and artistic camaraderie you found in St Leonard's and Hastings. She's asking, is there anything missing for you in relation to your work, and what else would you like to see?
We really need a cultural hub, so a space where we can be and sort of have our own gallery space. I would say a meeting hub. Other towns have a cultural building for global majority people, and I think we really need that.
Yeah, I would agree. I really feel that we need some kind of art centre, so you know that we can feel comfortable to go to, but also like sort of studios or I don't know, areas where we just meet and talk, share ideas. I don't think it's an alien concept. I just think that we need to find that space and then find the funding to make it happen. You know, and just seeing what we're able to do in less than a year to make this show. Imagine if we were given like £100,000 and they said, right, go and find that space and, you know, deck it out and make it into something, a great meeting point. But I think that's what we've shown through all our meetings and talking and what have you, events. That's what's needed. That's what's missing now. Some kind of central space where we can congregate. Yeah, I would say.
Can I just add, a lot of what we do is kicking down doors because doors are not open. So what is needed is a door to be open. Come in. Right, because kicking down doors is tiring, and so it'd be nice to have a door open and for people to come and say, we have funding to support you.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with all of that. I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely, it would be fabulous. What I'd like to have, and what I'm hoping as a consequence of the show, is that we stop being excluded from all the things that are going on in the town. Because what happens when you do confront someone or an organization or group, they say, oh, but I didn't know that, or I couldn't find, or, you know, I didn't realize. And now there's no excuse for that. You know, we are out here, we've shown you we're out here. So I would like to see that, you know, see that different, you know, that there's a real change. And I agree, for everybody, I would love to see that building now more accessible to local artists. I can't tell you how many artists there are living in this town, and really good, serious, international reputation artists and craftspeople, and they don't get a foot in the door. So what I would love to see is that this has been a catalyst to organizations like Hastings Contemporary think, look, let's look at who's in our backyard and give them space and give them some exposure.
Do you think, therefore, that you've almost created a template that could be rolled out, if you like, to other art groups or other kinds of regional spaces to say, well, actually, look at who's in your backyard, if you like, to other groups that maybe think that they're marginalized in those other small Black groups or other small hubs, to say, this is how you can get the support to put on a show or to find your space, if you like, to take up space, as if we want to use the phrase, and to be in the space. Do you think that you've created a clarion call, if you like?
I think so. And one of the things that I would say is in the exhibition, if you haven't been, like, we've got Braille labels, you know, we've got Braille handbook, we did an audio trail, we did audio files. This is just us as a small group. And I think it's a template for widening accessibility as well, because, you know, my eyes have been opened so much more to those artists, which is, you know, the intersection of not having space. So I would say, you know, disability and inclusion are so important. And somebody put, are we planning to tour? Yes, we are planning to tour. Watch this space.
Oh, wow. So I was going to ask that question, are you planning to tour? So you are planning to tour. So, okay. So keep us informed. So keep watching on the Instagram for We Out Here is gonna tour. So we've got a comment from Imogen who says she went to see the show last week and it was incredible. The Woman in Blue elevator and its connection to music really moved me. Paul's large artwork in black stitched embossed leather also had to me the quality of polished stone and was incredibly deep with its layering. And the scale of Elaine and Maggie's artworks, and she's loving the conversation. So this notion that what we've already discussed, this notion of how you've taken the artwork and elevated it so that all your craft and your practices, and I think this notion that for years you've been doing your work, and it's the conversation we had before we went online, was this notion of how as practitioners you've been steadily we talked about this notion of steadily just doing our stuff, but also how we learn from the practices of back home. And I'm just drawing on Elaine's, on Maggie's question about waste waste colonialism, and I'm sure it's probably a term that not many people kind of understand or have used before, but this notion that waste colonialism, I was talking about the flower bags that we use back home. So for those that don't know what flower bag is, a flower bag or a crocus bag is the waste. in the Caribbean we don't grow wheat, so we have flour. Flour is imported, and the bags that the flour comes in are reused to make clothes. If you were poor, then the flour bag was the thing that was the fine cotton was used to make your clothing or your cricket whites. As there's a writer that talks about, a Barbadian writer that talks about using the flour bags to make cricket clothing, or the crocus bag is used as the thing to decorate your flooring. So sustaining practices are inherent within our Caribbean culture, but we didn't call it sustainability. We don't have a name for it. We didn't call it sustainability back in the 50s and 60s, or even beyond that. We have Dorcas societies were around in the 1800s, where they were using reused cloth and charity. We think about jumble sales here as arriving and opening in the late 1800s and being a thing, but we were doing that way before that in the Caribbean. But we didn't call that, we didn't have this recycling theme, if you like. Waste colonialism, Maggie, do you want to expand on that kind of theme within your work and kind of talk about those, that, like I said before, we have that sustaining practice is inherent within our Caribbean lifestyle.
Yeah,
our parents didn't throw anything away.
Yeah, no. I mean, that's a really good point. I think, you know, what struck me is, I mean, most of us on the call will know what we mean by colonialism. We've studied it at school. We have a sense of that colonizing of another culture and removing what you want from it. So the global north taking materials, taking anything they need. So Elaine's piece speaks very clearly about cobalt being extracted. So we're aware of that. But what struck me, and by the way, it's a term that was coined by the United Nations in the late 80s, I think someone came up with that notion of what's happening, is that we're taking, you know, sort of, well, it's robbing and pillaging really, but we're removing the minerals, the, you know, the riches in the global south. And we've done that for a long time, and we've understood that in a way. And then we're using them and manufacturing them, using them for whatever we want to do. And then we are dumping the waste products from that back into those countries. And so there's this curious cycle. So they're getting hit both ways. If you want to get a broader conversation, you know, if you look at the gross national produce of any of those countries that are having waste dumped on them, one of the reasons that they're struggling is because their natural resources have been extracted and they can't, you know, so it's this cycle. So what I wanted to talk about specifically, because my background is in textiles and in fashion textiles is how I started, it was remarkable to me to put my nose into what's gone on with what's called fast fashion. And, you know, long story short, when I studied, we had 4 collections a year out of Paris and Milan. Now there's 20, you know, 900 new garments, new designs are being produced by Nova every week. And they're being done, if you follow the supply line of that. You know, we've got the cotton, the water, all these things are being paid for in lives and resources in the global south. We then make the design, but the exploitation of the workers is happening in the global south, you know, particularly in Bangladesh. But, you know, I can give you a list of these countries. So we go back there. Then we take these produce, we wear them, where we spend a lot of money focusing, targeting young women to buy and throw away. And then big business comes in yet again. It's a huge business, the recycling business. You know, here in Hastings and on this coast in general, we're really good at recycling and repurposing. You know, we really do our best. We put our clothes into these big hubs where they are supposedly, and actually it's not true. You know, Hastings, most of our actual rubbish goes to Singapore. It's cheaper, a deal is done. You know, there are lots of stories, but basically I wanted to talk to that, and I wanted to draw attention to the way in which this glossy image of buy, consume, everything is peachy, the consequences in the global south, and how this is really important as a Black maker. You know, this is, my people are over there, my people are getting dry, my people are running out of water. This isn't an abstract, oh, there's a bit of plastic in the sea and I can't swim. This is very serious. You know, islands are disappearing. We talk about the Caribbean. You know, this is, so, you know, waste colonialism is more than just a term. It's really something that we need to, I think, as people of colour, really engage in, as in the same way that we've done with so-called traditional colonialism, because it's ruining countries. It's just ruining them. Does that answer your question, Rose? Sorry. I feel passionately about it, so I can go on for hours.
I think as a coming from a textiles textiles background, just like you, I've always thought about where does our stuff go? Where does it come from? And my mum, like Lorna's mum, was a dressmaker, and she used every scrap of cloth. She would never, no bit of cloth ever got thrown away. And so this notion of, but where does our stuff come from? Where does it go? Where does it? And this notion that we've always grown up with this notion of sustaining practices, not sustainability. There's a difference between sustainability as an economic model, but sustaining practices that are embedded within our, which I call our DNA. They're embedded within our, with it, when you go back home, you see those sustaining practices. You see the people still have chickens running about in the backyard. You go home and you want to eat some meat, you go kill the chicken. You want mangoes in season, you go pick it off the tree. It's this notion that this food to farm to table existence. Our parents and some of our relatives still existence. They don't necessarily have to go to the supermarket for every bit of food. It's grown. We've been if you've been back home and you've been up country, as they call it, you've lived that life where stuff, you know where the food comes from. And so this is our sustaining practices are sometimes inherent in the way that we might think about waste and colonialism and how we might engage with those what I call sustaining practices, rather than this economic model of sustainability, which we see as wasteful. And we talk in that, there's that Jamaican saying, waste, I've forgotten it now, that you shouldn't waste stuff, waste not what who want you no getty as they call it. And this notion of not wasting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting conversation around waste capitalism, because there's a real cycle of colonialism that continues, and it just depends on what is the thing. So with fashion, it's been the speed has been, like Maggie was saying, instead of 4 shows a year, now you can have as many as you want because you can produce it so quickly, and then you can dispose of it so quickly. But the material breakdown is much slower. So, for example, where you would have been able to upcycle cotton, or you would have been upcycle wool, you can't with these materials that don't break down. So they're not even biodegradable, but they're being dumped on countries in the global south. In the case of my work, I'm speaking to racial capitalism, because I think that capitalism is inherently racist. Without racism, you cannot have it. And it's a way that we in the West, in the global North, are talking about green energy and living, carbon neutral lives, and we're going to be, eco-conscious. But the cost for that kind of lifestyle that we're also wanting is at the cost of the people in the global South. So, the cobalt that my work is about is extracted from the DRC. And the 30% of the cobalt cobalt is used in all our electronic devices, in your mobile phone, in your electronic vehicles. And so that's the notion that we're all going to move over to electric vehicles. But cobalt is mined by children in the DRC. And these miners, not the industrial miners, but these miners are called artisanal miners. And so I want you to be conscious of that word when you think of artisanal as a kind of marketing term to describe something that's handmade, or, it's crafted, or it's skilled, but actually it's basically indigenous slave labor. So again, it's the way that capitalism works. So that we on the global South are feeling really good about ourselves because we're being sustainable, but that cost has been deferred or being imposed on the global South. And just want to make that point.
And just to add, Elaine, I mean, just another piece in terms of craft, this overproduction and then waste has killed the textiles and the making in, for example, Uganda and Kenya. People used to have sustainable practices. You would make do and mend, you could change. The local woman on the corner would have a sewing machine. They have disappeared because they can't compete, with the price. So it has a huge ramifications for makers all over the global South. I think it's really a serious issue.
I agree.
And I think it's the same, like when you go back to the Caribbean, you used to be able to see on those little shacks with the pedal sewing machines, and they would be mending your clothes or sewing. You'd go on different islands, you'd see those pedal sewing machines, and the makers making the school uniforms for the kids or whatever. And you'd see you because they didn't have to use electricity, because electricity costs money, but you could see the pedal sewing machines dotted around all the islands. So this notion of how different kind of practices disappear because of various new ways of working, if you like. We did have a question from the US saying sadly they can't visit the show, but I think Lorna's answered put the catalogue out there. So thank you, Lorna. The questions are coming in thick and fast. Kim has asked about the irony about these practices, impact on climate and have a knock-on effect on our on us. Jo said that she lived in Trinidad and she used to take her designer Vogue patterns back as a young black tailor, and a young black tailor who lived up in the hills, and he used to make them up for her. So this notion that we can take things from here and take them back to makers that make things. So this notion of this migration and moving between spaces. So you take things from one place and move them to another, and they get made, and then you bring them back. It's kind of like, what did Louise Bennett used to talk about, migration in reverse. She has that famous poem about migration in reverse. And in some ways, when I look at the show, I think about migration in reverse, how we can talk about our transitionary practices and translation, what do I call it? This notion of the poetics and politics and representations in your work, the absences, the histories, the stories, and how you speak about inclusion and exclusion. And we've got probably just 10 minutes left to kind of close up. And I wonder if you want to just, anybody just wants to finish off now on talking about how we can reconcile our histories, whether personal or otherwise, in these trajectories that we've discussed over the last hour. And then if there are any other questions from the audience, if you've got any questions, you need to put them in now. Any observations that you want to put them in now, because we've kind of put the questions in as we've been doing this. But any questions you've got, you need to send them in now. But as we're waiting for the questions to come in, can we ask if there's anything that you want to think about, that kind of, how do we reconcile these histories that we've been talking about in terms of craft and our personal histories as crafters, makers, and how we continue to do these works as we elevate our individual crafts, but also as we elevate the histories that we want to tell.
Rose, can we, if people don't want to write their questions, if they want to put their hand up to ask a question, that's cool.
Have you got anybody got, I can't see all the
they've got a burning question, do the hand thing.
Well, can I put something else into the pot? Because when we were talking about what we've learned and where we learned from and our families, and I just think there's also a big issue of class in this conversation. And, you know, for those of us that were raised working class and poor and immigrant, you were very used to make do and mend, and so that was how your life was. And I think that transcends race. I think if you were a white working class background too, you know, there would be those because you didn't have any choice. And I think age makes a difference, because if you were older and working class, you had those skills because you had to mend things. You couldn't, you know, do what we do now. So I think that's something else that we can be really proud of, you know, that it was normalized for us. It's not something we had to learn how to have hard work or learn how to use our hands. It was all around us, you know, in our families, if we were raised working class.
Yeah, so that's true.
Just have another question as well. Have any of the artists found the experience of working as a collective on this exhibition changed the way they move forward in their practice?
It changed the way.
I think, Paul, you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I thought so. I just feel that it's opened the possibilities of just working on a different scale. I mean, I think I work more within the idea of, I suppose, I felt I was always kind of a bit radical when I was working with leather workers who trained like me, but I think I'm now even more radical. So the master saddler who didn't come to the opening, whose view I would have really wanted, and that was Katrine Coppins from the Royal Mews Saddlery at Buckingham Palace. I mean, her view of my work, which I think was probably, told me a lot, was interesting. And I think that then you know that you're outside of the classical areas that she would understand. It's not a bridle, it's not a harness, it's not for heavy horses, it's not for the state carriage. What you're doing is interesting. So I think that's an affirmation. I'm officially away from horses. I'm in the area of interesting, which is what I think I would name.
Yeah. Winnie.
I think for me, what's been interesting in is that I've never worked in a collective of Black artists. But this is a new experience. And, just how sometimes when you're with fellow people, there's things that you don't have to say. It's been interesting, I don't have to explain a lot of stuff. We just get on with it. So I would like to continue, even if it's in my individual practice, to still be connected to the other artists, because it's that thing of throwing ideas, which has been really great. And I think for so long, you get used to, you just got to be on your own. You just got to get on with it. But it's just like, oh, can breathe. And I think coming back to Hastings, there's a lot of collaboration happening wider within Hastings with other groups. So we're in this sort of phase where we're working with other people, we're going to exhibitions together. So long may it continue.
There's a question that comes in that joins up exactly what you've just said, and the question comes from Elizabeth, and she says, does the panel have a view about the new generation of young Black artists coming through now?
Do they have a view of it?
Do you have a view about the new generation of young Black artists coming through now?
Yeah, I'm excited for them, and I'm hoping that life will be easier for them. And I think one of the things that we haven't really mentioned that's made life easier for all of us, and that's the internet, and that's given us opened up the world of possibilities of connections. And I think for young artists in general, but for young Black artists, I think that's been a godsend at the digital age. And I think a lot of them are sort of digital natives in the way that some of us older ones are not. So I think the fact that they have the online platforms where they can exhibit and connect, etc., I think that's been really, really healthy for them. But for us older, artists who've been working primarily in isolation in a lot of in instances, and working in other spaces where we're the only person, and so we have ageism against us because we're working with younger people, class, again, being working class, and then Black on top, you're ticking 5 of the boxes they like to joke about. So I think that for me, having this, having peers, having Black peers in the vicinity, it's wonderful. You're not alone, and I'm happy for the younger ones. I think it's great, but I think us older ones also, the credit due, because it's about time. That's all I'm saying.
I think for me, with the like a lot of what I do, we're not going to necessarily benefit from, but we're putting a foot in the door, so it's easy for the next generation. But I think I'm inspired by the younger generation and what they're doing, and also different ways of working. So I find they inspire me, and I hope that they realise that they don't need to have gallery representation. There's new ways of working, and they would exploit all the new different ways, and not get put in the box of what we did, that they will do their own path. And I'm sure all of us, we're happy to give advice and to mentor.
And as we're down to the last 4 minutes, I can just go, well, I think that ends off the conversation. I think somebody just put in the chat that I think some of you are that there's an exhibition shown, some of you are going to be shown at a textile exhibition in July in St Leonard's.
Yeah.
Textile Junction.
Yeah, Maggie and I are in there, aren't we, Maggie?
So people look out for Textile Junction in St Leonard's in July. You'll see some more. And I think the fact that this older generation is inspired by the younger generation, and I hope the younger generation is inspired by this older generation of artists who are showing that with this amazing kind of collective work, their collective discourse, their collective what I call knowledge base, their collective exchange base. They've been able to actually open some doors. So it's actually never too late to open those doors, but their collective knowledge, their collective strength, their collective fortitude has actually shown what you can do when you knock on the doors of the institution, and then you show them that this is what we can do as Black artists. We can challenge the craft space, we can challenge the what it means to talk about Black craft, talk about Black art, what it means to actually question some of the key issues of transition, of moving, of waste colonialism, of sustaining practices, of what is knitting, what is leatherwork, what is craft. We've shown that we can elevate our work in spaces. And I think this is the conversation that could go on. And if you haven't yet been to see the show, get down to Hastings, see the show, buy the catalogue because it's a one-off. Go get the catalogue because you're not going to get it again. Go get the catalogue.
When it's gone, it's gone.
As well.
It's gone.
Yeah.
Legacy document.
It's gone. It's a so what is the legacy? I think the legacy is that here is a template to show the intersections of accessibility and craft, curatorial activism, those key words, and start using, because this is what this work is. It's curatorial activism and acts of resistance, but it's elevating craft to a different level. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming and spending time with us and talking about Black craft and how it hits these real new areas of design and activism in the institutional space. Have a good evening, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate